Hello and welcome to Cheating Message. Subscribe to the channel by clicking on the bell to not miss new videos. And don't forget to like us because it's the best support for us. Emma Matthews sat alone in her spacious living room, the echo of her husband James' words still reverberating in her mind. Just an hour earlier, she had believed her life was perfect. Successful architect, loving wife, and a beautiful home in London. But in a single moment, everything shattered. "I'm leaving you, Emma," James had said, his voice cold and distant. "I've met someone else. I never meant for it to happen, but it has." Emma had stared at him in disbelief, her world tilting off its axis. She had always believed they were the perfect couple. Sure, life had gotten busy. Her demanding job, his work commitments, but wasn't that normal? Weren't they like every other couple? Apparently not. Now, as she looked around the home they had built together, every corner held memories of a life she thought was real. Their wedding photos on the mantel seemed like a cruel joke. How could everything she had believed in be a lie? With a trembling hand, Emma picked up her phone and dialed her best friend, Sophie. "He's gone, Soph," she whispered, her voice breaking. "James is leaving me." There was silence on the other end. Then the sound of Sophie's sharp intake of breath. "Aunt Emma, I'm so sorry." "What happened?" "Another woman," Emma said flatly, her voice void of emotion. She couldn't afford to feel. Not yet. If she did, she feared the pain would consume her. "I don't even know who she is. He just left." "I'll come over," Sophie offered immediately. "No, I need to be alone," Emma replied, her heart aching with the weight of her words. She needed to process this by herself, to understand what had gone so terribly wrong. For days, Emma moved through her home like a ghost, surrounded by the debris of her life with James. Eventually, the numbness gave way to anger and then, slowly, to clarity. She couldn't live like this, trapped in the shadow of a broken marriage. It was time to move on. She had to. That's when she made the decision to sell the house and leave London. The idea of starting over somewhere else had always felt like running away, but now it seemed like the only choice. There was nothing left for her here. A month later, with her belongings packed and the house sold, Emma found herself driving back to Dorset, the small coastal town where she had grown up. The drive was both freeing and terrifying. Her parents had passed years ago, but she still owned the quaint little cottage her grandmother had left her. It was far from the city, both in distance and lifestyle, but maybe that's what she needed, a clean slate. The cottage, nestled on a quiet street, was charming but in desperate need of repair. As she stood in front of it, Emma felt a small flicker of hope. This place could be hers. No memories of James, no echoes of the life she'd lost. Just her and whatever came next. That evening, Emma sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the hills. The peacefulness of the countryside was a stark contrast to the noise and chaos of London. For the first time in weeks, she felt a small measure of calm. Maybe this was what she needed, to strip away everything and start from the beginning. She would take the cottage, fix it up, and turn it into something new. The idea of opening a café had come to her almost unexpectedly. There were few places in town for people to gather, and the thought of creating a space where locals could come for coffee and conversation felt right. It would be a challenge, but if she could build skyscrapers, surely she could manage a small café. But her optimism quickly waned as reality set in. The cottage needed extensive renovations, and the townspeople, many of whom she remembered from her childhood, were not exactly welcoming. Dorset was a small town, and outsiders, even those returning home, were treated with suspicion. As the days passed, Emma struggled with the renovations, the business plans, and the cold reception from the locals. She had hoped this move would offer her peace and a sense of purpose, but instead, it felt like she was stumbling at every step. Every morning, she woke with a sense of dread, unsure if she had made the right choice. Then one day, while she was attempting to fix a leaky pipe in the cafe, someone knocked on the door. Wiping her hands on a towel, she opened it to find Tom standing there, a familiar yet older face from her past. Tom! Emma blinked, surprised to see her old classmate from school. He hadn't changed much, tall, broad-shouldered, with the same kind eyes she remembered. "Emma," he said, his voice warm and welcoming. "I heard you were back in town. Thought I'd come by and see how you were doing." Emma smiled, grateful for a friendly face. "I'm surviving. Trying to at least." Tom glanced behind her, where half-painted walls and unfinished furniture told the story of her struggle. "Looks like you could use some help." "I could," she admitted with a sigh. "I didn't realize how much work this place needed." "Well," Tom said with a grin, "lucky for you, I know a thing or two about fixing things up. Mind if I lend a hand?" Emma hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'd love that, actually. Thank you." As they worked side by side, Emma found herself opening up to Tom in a way she hadn't with anyone else since James had left. There was something comforting about being around someone who had known her before her life had taken such a drastic turn. Tom didn't pry into her personal life, but his presence was a steadying force. With him around, Emma began to feel like maybe, just maybe, she could make this work. But life in Dorset wasn't without its challenges. Emma still struggled with the business, and the locals remained wary. Yet, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of connection to the town she had once called home, and to the man who had quietly become her biggest supporter. What she didn't realize was that Dorset held more surprises than she could ever have anticipated, and one of them was about to come knocking on her door. The morning light poured through the windows of the small café as Emma stood behind the counter, wiping down surfaces and preparing for another slow day. Despite Tom's help, business had not taken off the way she had hoped. A few locals wandered in now and then, but the majority stayed away, eyeing her new venture with skepticism. She had come to Dorset to start over, but starting over was proving harder than she had anticipated. The door chimed, and Emma looked up to see Tom walking in, carrying a wooden toolbox. He gave her a warm smile as he made his way toward the counter. "Morning," he said, setting the toolbox down on the floor. "Thought I'd stop by and fix that squeaky cabinet door for you." "Thanks, Tom," Emma said, grateful for his ongoing support. "I'd appreciate it. That thing's been driving me crazy." As he bent down to get to work, Emma poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the counter beside him. She had come to rely on his presence more than she cared to admit. Over the past few weeks, Tom had been her constant companion, helping with the renovations, offering advice when business faltered, and keeping her grounded when doubt crept in. "How's it going?" Tom asked, looking up from the cabinet. Emma sighed. "It's slow. I thought people would be more curious, maybe a bit more welcoming, but it feels like they're waiting for me to fail." Tom frowned. "You've got to give it time. Dorset's a small town, and change doesn't come easy here. People don't mean any harm. They're just cautious, I guess," Emma replied, though she couldn't help feeling discouraged. "I just thought this would be a fresh start, but sometimes it feels like I'm walking uphill every day." Tom stood up and wiped his hands on a cloth, giving her a reassuring smile. "You're doing fine, Emma. More than fine. You just need to hang in there. I've seen the way people look at this place. Once they warm up to the idea, you'll have more business than you know what to do with." His words were comforting, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling of doubt gnawing at her. Still, she managed to smile. "I hope you're right." Before Tom could respond, the door chimed again, and Emma's heart sank as she saw who had entered. Mrs. Perkins, one of the older women from the village, stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes scanning the cafe. Behind her, a few other local women hovered, whispering amongst themselves. "Morning, Mrs. Perkins," Emma greeted, forcing herself to sound cheerful. "Can I get you something? Coffee? A pastry?" Mrs. Perkins gave a curt nod. "Coffee, I suppose. No milk. None of that fancy stuff." Emma quickly poured the coffee and handed it over with a smile, but Mrs. Perkins didn't seem interested in pleasantries. Instead, she sipped the drink slowly, her eyes never leaving Emma. "So, this is what you're doing with your grandmother's house, eh?" Mrs. Perkins finally said, her tone clipped, turning it into a café for city folk. Emma stiffened. "I wanted to bring something new to the town. I thought a café might be nice for everyone." Mrs. Perkins narrowed her eyes. "Well, not everyone's keen on changes around here. Your grandmother was a good woman, respected in this community. I hope you know what you're doing." The weight of the words hung in the air, and Emma felt a pang of insecurity. She had known the transition wouldn't be easy, but hearing it from someone who had known her family felt different. It felt personal. "I'm trying my best," Emma replied, her voice softer than she intended. Tom, sensing the tension, stepped forward. "Emma's doing a great job, Mrs. Perkins. The cafe is coming along, and I think the town will appreciate it once they get used to it." Mrs. Perkins sniffed, but said nothing further. She took another sip of her coffee and turned to leave, the group of women following her out the door. When the door closed, Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That went well," she muttered. Tom gave her a sympathetic look. "Don't take it to heart. Mrs. Perkins has been like that for as long as I can remember. She doesn't speak for the whole town." "I know, but it's hard not to feel judged," Emma said, rubbing her temples. "I didn't come here to cause trouble. I just wanted a fresh start. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere that felt like home again." Tom leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. "It will feel like home, Emma. You just need to give it time. Besides, not everyone's like Mrs. Perkins. People will come around." Emma looked at him, her heart warmed by his unwavering confidence in her. "Thanks, Tom. I don't know what I'd do without you." Tom smiled, a touch of something unreadable in his eyes. "You'd be fine. You're stronger than you think." Emma opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the door chimed again. This time, however, the person standing in the doorway made her heart stop. James! Her ex-husband stood there, looking every bit as polished and put together as he had the day he'd left her. His suit was immaculate, his hair neatly combed, and that familiar, disarming smile played on his lips. For a moment, Emma couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shock of seeing him here in Dorset of all places was too overwhelming. "Emma," James said, his voice soft and almost apologetic. "Can we talk?" Her world spun, and she gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. She had spent the last few months trying to forget him, trying to rebuild her life after he had so casually shattered it. And now, here he was standing in her new life, as if he had every right to be. Tom, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, stood up straighter, his gaze flicking between Emma and James. "Is everything okay?" Emma swallowed hard, her eyes never leaving James. "Tom, could you give us a moment?" Tom hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with leaving her alone with the man who had caused her so much pain. But finally he nodded. "I'll be just outside if you need me." As Tom left, Emma forced herself to speak. "What are you doing here, James?" He took a step closer, his eyes pleading. "I've made a mistake, Emma." "I?" "You don't get to say that," she interrupted, her voice stronger than she felt. "You left me. You didn't just make a mistake. You tore my life apart." James looked down, his expression full of regret. "I know, and I'm sorry. I thought I wanted something else. But it's over. It was a mistake, and I see that now." Emma's heart raced, a mix of anger and disbelief coursing through her. She had dreamt of this moment, the moment when James would come crawling back, admitting he was wrong. But now that it was happening, she didn't feel the satisfaction she had imagined. All she felt was confusion and hurt. "What do you want, James?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers. "I want you back, Emma. I want to come home." The words hung in the air like a lead weight, pressing down on her heart. This was the man she had loved, the man she had built a life with. But that life was gone now, shattered beyond repair. And standing here in the cafe she had built with her own 2 hands, Emma wasn't sure if she wanted that life back. "I don't know if I can do that," she whispered, her voice breaking. James looked desperate now, reaching for her hand. "Emma, please. We can make it work. I know we can." She pulled her hand away, her mind spinning with uncertainty. What was she supposed to do now? The silence between them stretched painfully as Emma stared at James, his words echoing in her mind. He wanted her back. After all the pain, the sleepless nights, and the months of self-doubt, he had reappeared as if he could just step back into her life, as if the wounds he had left behind could be neatly bandaged up with an apology. She searched his face, trying to find traces of the man she once loved. But all she could see now was someone she no longer recognized, a stranger who had betrayed her trust. The reality of it hit her hard. No matter how much she had once loved him, the life they shared was gone. "James, Emma began, but the words faltered on her lips. She didn't know what to say. James took a step closer, his eyes pleading. "I know I hurt you, Emma. I know I messed up, but I want to make things right. I realize now that what I had with her, it wasn't real. It was a mistake. You and we belong together." His words stirred a whirlpool of emotions within her. Confusion, anger, even a flicker of the love she had once felt. But alongside all of that was a newfound strength she hadn't had before. Since James had left, she had rebuilt herself, brick by brick, in this quiet town. She had faced uncertainty, loneliness, and the crushing weight of failure. And yet, she had survived. She looked away from him, her heart aching. "James, I've spent months trying to move on. You didn't just hurt me, you broke me. And now you think you could just come back and fix everything with a few words?" His face crumpled, and for a moment, she saw vulnerability in his eyes. "I never stopped loving you, Emma. I was confused. I let myself get swept up in something that wasn't real. But that was real. It still is." Emma's breath hitched. She had once dreamed of hearing him say those exact words, but standing here now, in this cafe that represented everything she had fought to rebuild, they felt hollow. The door creaked open, and Tom reappeared, his face tense as he glanced between the two of them. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice cautious. James turned to face Tom, his expression tightening with suspicion. "I'm talking to my wife," he said curtly, as if Tom's presence were an unwelcome intrusion. Emma felt a surge of protectiveness rise within her, and before she could stop herself, she stepped forward. "Tom's been helping me, James. He's been here when I needed someone." James' eyes narrowed. "I see. So that's how it is then? You move here, start over, and now there's someone else?" The accusation in his voice sent a shockwave through Emma. She blinked in disbelief, struggling to comprehend the audacity of it. "You left me, James," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You made that choice. You don't get to stand here and act like I owe you anything." Tom, sensing the rising tension, placed a steadying hand on Emma's shoulder. "Maybe you should leave, mate," he said evenly. "It seems like Emma's made a new life here." James' face flushed with anger. "I'm not going anywhere. This is between me and Emma." Emma felt her pulse quicken as the moments spiraled out of control. Tom's presence was a comfort, but the confrontation between the two men only heightened her confusion. She didn't want a battle between them, especially not here, in the place she was working so hard to build. "Stop it, both of you," she said, her voice firm but trembling. "This isn't about Tom or you, James. This is about me, what I want for my life." Both men turned to her, and for a moment, the cafe felt too small, too suffocating. Emma took a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts. She had spent months reclaiming her sense of self, her strength. And yet, here she was again, caught between her past and an uncertain future. "James," she said slowly, her eyes locked on his. "I loved you. I built my life around you. But you destroyed that, and it's taken everything I have to pick up the pieces. His face softened, and for a moment, she saw the man she had fallen in love with, the man she had believed in. Emma, I'm sorry. I know I can never undo what I did, but please let's try again. Let's start over. Emma closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on her. But as much as his apology stirred old feelings, it wasn't enough. She couldn't go back to who she was before. She had changed. She had fought too hard to find her footing again, and she wasn't about to lose it. I can't, Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. James blinked, as if her words hadn't fully registered. What do you mean? You can't just throw away everything we had. Emma shook her head, her heart breaking all over again. I'm not throwing it away. I'm letting it go. The silence that followed felt like the final crack of a shattered mirror. James' shoulders slumped, and the fight seemed to drain out of him. He stood there for a moment, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. Finally, he nodded, his face pale and resigned. I see, he said quietly. I guess I should go. Emma felt a pang of sorrow as she watched him turn toward the door, but it was accompanied by a sense of relief, an unburdening that allowed her to breathe again. She had made her choice, and it was the hardest decision she had ever made. But it was hers. As James left, Tom remained by her side, his presence a steady reminder of the new life she was building. He didn't say anything, simply watching her with quiet understanding. Emma exhaled, the tension in her body slowly releasing. I didn't think it would hurt this much, she said softly, her eyes still on the door. It's never easy, Tom replied, his voice gentle. But you did the right thing. Emma nodded, though her heart was still heavy. She had done the right thing, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. She had loved James once, deeply, and letting him go felt like closing the door on a part of her life she had thought would last forever. I don't know what happens next, she admitted, glancing at Tom. I feel like I'm starting from scratch again. Tom smiled, his eyes full of warmth. Then we start from scratch together, he said. You've already come this far, Emma. You're stronger than you think. Emma looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so alone. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the past slowly lifting as the sun streamed through the windows. Emma glanced around the café, the place she had worked so hard to create. It wasn't perfect, and she knew the road ahead would still have its share of struggles. But for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. Let's get back to work, she said with a small, determined smile. We got a café to run. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind for Emma. Life in the café carried on, and with each passing day, she began to feel more settled, more at peace with her decision to let go of James and the life they had once shared. She had chosen Dorset for a fresh start, and now it truly felt like she was living it. Tom had become a steady presence, helping her with repairs and renovations in the café. He was there in the early mornings, sometimes before she even arrived, fixing a leaky faucet or sanding down the café's wooden tables. His quiet support had become something she relied on, though she didn't quite know how to express how much it meant to her. Morning, Tom called one day as he came in through the back door, tools in hand, his usual smile lighting up his face. Morning, Tom, Emma replied, glancing up from the counter where she was preparing coffee for the day. The café still wasn't bustling, but there were regulars now, people who had warmed to her little shop. Even Mrs. Perkins had been back twice, though she never stayed long enough for Emma to feel completely comfortable around her. Tom set down his toolbox and pulled up a chair near the counter, his expression thoughtful. I was thinking, he began, maybe you could try hosting a small event here, something to bring more people in, like an art show or a live music night. Emma raised her eyebrows in surprise. An event? Here? Why not? Tom said, shrugging. People are curious, but they don't always know how to break the ice. If you give them a reason to come, it could help. Plus, you got this great space. Might as well use it. Emma considered it. her fingers idly tracing the edge of a coffee mug. "That's actually not a bad idea," she admitted. "I just don't know where to start." Tom grinned. "I know some local musicians. I can ask around, maybe see if someone would be willing to play a few songs. And you could talk to that art shop down the road. There's a gallery owner who might want to display some pieces here." Emma's mind began racing with possibilities. It was exactly the kind of thing she hadn't dared to consider before, but with Tom's encouragement, it seemed less daunting. "Okay," she said with a nod. "Let's give it a try." The two spent the next few days planning the event, reaching out to the local community and putting together flyers to spread the word. Tom made calls, pulling strings with people he knew, while Emma worked tirelessly to prepare the cafe, rearranging the furniture to create a cozy, welcoming space for guests. The day of the event arrived faster than she expected, and the cafe had never looked better. Twinkling string lights hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the tables. A small corner stage had been set up for the musicians, and pieces of local artwork adorned the walls, giving the cafe a fresh, vibrant energy. As evening approached, Emma felt her nerves rising. She paced behind the counter, wondering if anyone would actually show up. Tom appeared beside her, sensing her unease. "People will come," he said softly, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You've done a great job." She smiled gratefully at him. "I hope so." And he was right. Slowly but surely, people began to trickle in. Locals Emma hadn't spoken to before, neighbors who had watched the cafe take shape but hadn't yet come inside. The musicians began playing soft, acoustic melodies, and the chatter of guests filled the room. The atmosphere was lively and warm, and for the first time, Emma felt like the cafe was alive in the way she had always imagined it could be. As the evening went on, Emma wandered through the crowd, chatting with guests and offering them coffee. She received compliments on the cafe's decor, the music, and the overall experience, and each one bolstered her confidence. This was what she had wanted, a space where people could come together, share stories, and feel at home. "Looks like a success," Tom said, coming up beside her with a cup of coffee in hand. He leaned casually against the counter, watching the musicians play with a satisfied smile. Emma exhaled, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. "I think it is." They stood side by side for a moment, taking it all in. The cafe felt warm, full of life and laughter. Emma turned to Tom, a wave of gratitude sweeping over her. "I couldn't have done this without you," she said quietly. Tom shrugged, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "You would have figured it out." "No, I mean it, Tom," Emma insisted, turning to face him. "You've been here every step of the way. I don't think I've thanked you properly for that." He met her gaze, his expression softening. "You don't need to thank me, Emma. I'm just glad I could help." Their eyes locked for a moment, and Emma felt her heart stir with something she hadn't felt in a long time. It was a warmth that went beyond gratitude, a growing connection she hadn't expected but couldn't ignore. Tom had become more than just a friend. He had become a part of her new life, a part she couldn't imagine being without. Before she could respond, a familiar figure walked through the door. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the man standing just inside the entrance. James! She hadn't heard from him since the day he had shown up at the cafe, begging for her to take him back. And now, here he was again, his presence throwing her world into turmoil once more. Tom noticed the change in her and followed her gaze to the door. His jaw tightened when he saw James, but he remained silent, waiting for Emma's lead. James stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Emma. He didn't smile, and for a moment, he just stood there, watching her. Emma swallowed hard, her mind racing. What could he possibly want this time? She excused herself from Tom and walked toward James, her heart pounding in her chest. The last thing she wanted was a scene in front of all these people. "James," she greeted him, her voice calm but cautious. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to see you," James said, his expression unreadable. I've been thinking about what you said the last time we spoke. Emma crossed her arms, steeling herself against the wave of emotion his presence always seemed to bring. James, we've been through this. There's nothing more to say. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. Emma, I know I hurt you, and I know you don't want to hear this, but I can't stop thinking about us. I made the biggest mistake of my life, and I can't move on without at least trying to make things right. Emma's heart ached at his words. She had spent months untangling herself from the pain of their past, and now here he was, reopening the wounds she had fought so hard to heal. I have moved on, James, she said quietly, glancing back at the cafe bustling with life behind her. I'm building something new here, something I'm proud of. You don't get to just come back and disrupt that. James ran a hand through his hair, frustration flickering in his eyes. I'm not trying to disrupt anything. I don't know how to let go of what we had. Emma felt the weight of his words, the tug of old memories pulling at her. But as she looked around the cafe, at the people who had come together, at Tom waiting for her with quiet understanding in his eyes, she realized that she had already let go. Her life was here now, in this small town, in this cafe, in the friendships and connections she had built. You need to, James, she said firmly, her voice steady. I've moved on. You should too. The words hung between them, final and undeniable. For a moment, James said nothing, his expression one of defeat. Then, finally, he nodded, his shoulders slumping. Goodbye, Emma, he said, his voice low as he turned and walked out the door. Emma watched him leave, a strange mix of sadness and relief settling over her. She had loved James once, deeply, but that chapter of her life was over. And now, standing in the warmth of the cafe she had built from scratch, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. When she turned back, Tom was still standing by the counter, watching her with concern. She walked over to him, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Everything okay? He asked gently. Emma smiled, nodding. Yeah, she said, feeling the truth of it deep in her bones. It is now. The cafe was quieter now, the evening winding down as the last of the guests trickled out. Emma stood by the counter, feeling the lingering warmth of the night's success. The event had been more than she could have hoped for. New faces, old acquaintances, and a renewed sense of belonging. Tom was by her side, helping her tidy up. He didn't say much, but his presence was steady and comforting, just as it had been for months. Emma glanced at him, her heart full of gratitude and something more, a quiet, growing affection she could no longer ignore. As they wiped down the tables, Tom broke the silence. You did it, you know, he said softly. Tonight was a success. Emma smiled, feeling a rush of pride. We did it, she corrected, catching his eye. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Tom paused, leaning his hands on the table, his gaze soft but serious. Emma, you've done more than just open a cafe. You've rebuilt your life here, and it's been amazing to watch. Her heart swelled at his words. She had worked so hard to find her footing again, and now she could see how far she had come. But more than that, she realized how much Tom had become a part of this new life, how much he had come to mean to her. Tom, she began, her voice wavering slightly, I don't think I've ever told you just how much you mean to me. You've been here through everything, and She trailed off, unsure how to finish. But she didn't need to. Tom stepped closer, his eyes filled with understanding. You don't have to say anything, Emma. I'm just glad I've been here with you. He reached out, taking her hand in his. Emma's heart raced as their fingers intertwined. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt like the start of something new, something real. They stood there for a moment, the world outside quiet and still. Finally, Emma broke the silence, her voice soft but sure. I think I'm ready to see where this goes. Tom smiled, the warmth of it filling the room. So am I. As the last of the cafe's lights dimmed, Emma felt a profound sense of peace. Her journey hadn't been easy, but it had led her here, back to her hometown, to the café she had built with her own hands, and to Tom, who had been there through it all. For the first time in a long time, Emma knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Together, they stepped out into the night, hand in hand, ready to embrace whatever came next.